Donc merci beaucoup et bonne année à tous les participants du séminaire Spinoza. Nous entamons notre 11e année. C'est une source de grande fierté pour nous tous, pour les organisateurs. C'est un séminaire qui a une grande visibilité sur YouTube depuis maintenant 11 ans. On a à peu près accueilli 63 conférences et il y a 2700 abonnés, bon, ce qui n'est peut-être pas beaucoup pour une pop star, mais ce qui est pas mal pour un séminaire de philosophie sans concession comme le nôtre. Et puis nous ne sommes pas loin, ou même nous avons peut-être dépassé maintenant les 300 000 vues, ce qui est quand même pas mal non plus. Et il se trouve qu'aujourd'hui, l'équipe d'accueil LLCP, c'est-à-dire le laboratoire sur les logiques contemporaines de la philosophie auquel j'appartiens, auquel appartiennent les doctorants ici présents, a été évaluée au niveau national par l'HCERS, le Haut Comité pour l'évaluation de la recherche et de l'enseignement supérieur. On a reçu le rapport aujourd'hui. C'est un rapport très, très favorable et surtout qui met en avant, alors je l'ai transmis aux doctorants et anciens et docteurs de ce centre, qui a travaillé avec moi. Et le rapport souligne énormément l'existence de ce séminaire, sa visibilité, son rayonnement. Et donc, écoutez, en ce début de 11e année, c'était quand même le moment de s'en féliciter. Alors, ce n'est pas la meilleure période peut-être pour faire un public très nombreux en ce moment, parce que les cours n'ont pas encore recommencé. Donc l'université est encore déserte, les étudiants ne sont pas encore là, mais ce n'est pas important. On a justement cette diffusion en différé sur Internet qui permet de donner toute leur visibilité à nos conférences. Donc on reprend cette année 2024-2025 aujourd'hui, donc en janvier, et donc nous avons le grand plaisir d'accueillir André Santos Campos qui vient de l'université Nova de Lisbonne, maître de conférence en philosophie politique. Alors FCSH, je ne sais pas ce que ça veut dire, mais bon, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire ça?
C'est vrai. Faculté des sciences sociales et humaines. D'accord,
faculté des sciences sociales et humaines. Et donc, dont les recherches portent, comme vous l'avez vu sur l'affiche, sur les questions qui relient donc la théorie politique contemporaine à la philosophie du droit et à l'histoire des idées, en particulier donc la théorie démocratique et la justice intergénérationnelle. Donc André Santos Campos est l'auteur, donc entre autres, de Spinoza's Revolutions in Natural Law, Palgrave 2012. Donc c'est ce livre que je peux vous montrer, que vous trouvez facilement en ligne. Il faut l'acheter sur Kindle, parce que j'ai remarqué que les livres que vous avez écrits sont à un prix absolument énorme quand ils sont sous forme papier. Les éditeurs scientifiques se font plaisir, quoi. C'est des livres qui peuvent valoir 100 €, alors qu'on va les télécharger pour 19 ou 20 € sur Kindle. C'est ce que j'ai fait, bien sûr, parce que je trouvais ça un peu absurde de dépenser de telles sommes pour un livre en papier. C'est pas tout à fait normal, mais peu importe. En tout cas, c'est bien ce livre-là, 2012, que j'ai donc téléchargé et lu personnellement. Et on peut que vous inviter à le faire, j'en dirai 2 mots dans une seconde. Et aussi donc un livre plus récent, Semi-Future Democracy, A Liberal Theory on the Long Term View. Donc c'est à Édimbourg, University Press, 2024. Donc il est également l'éditeur, donc il a dirigé des collectifs d'un certain nombre de volumes, donc Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, nous c'est titre livre, on dit en français, nouvelle lecture chez Brill en 2021, Sovereignty as Value, en 2011, Spinoza and Law chez Routledge en 2016, Spinoza Basic Concepts donc en 2015, et encore Challenges to Democratic Participation en 2014. Donc c'est une activité de publication déjà très très riche. Donc je ne vais pas faire du tout la conférence à votre place, vous ne faites pas de soucis. J'ai quand même pris juste quelques mots sur ce livre de 2014, là, parce que moi c'est une question qui m'intéresse, Spinoza, The Revolution in Natural Law, puisque j'ai traduit le traité politique, donc c'est une question qui m'a beaucoup intéressé. Donc je ne vais pas parler de ce livre, je vais en dire juste 2 mots, juste 2 mots pour en donner une très vague idée, et puis je laisserai tout de suite la parole à notre invité qui parle de tout à fait autre chose aujourd'hui, enfin plus ou moins, enfin on verra bien. Et donc, dans ce livre, donc, sur cette idée qu'il y aurait de la part de Spinoza une révolution sur la loi naturelle, au sujet de la loi naturelle. Donc, c'est un livre dans lequel donc, André Santos Campos essaie de montrer que Spinoza a repris les termes les plus traditionnels de la philosophie de la loi naturelle et du droit naturel, mais en changeant profondément la signification et en opérant une espèce de révolution qui est le fait d'identifier le droit et la puissance. Comme vous dites, jus sive potentia, le droit ou la puissance, vous appelez ça une reconstruction par l'intérieur de la loi naturelle, inner reconstruction of natural law. Et donc, vous avez montré, c'est un livre très précis et très intéressant, que au fond, vous avez voulu soutenir, si je ne me trompe pas, une vision très immanentiste de Spinoza, c'est-à-dire avec cette idée qu'au fond, il y avait comme deux horizons dans la philosophie politique de Spinoza, comme deux personnages qui se voient réciproquement comme en réflexion, donc le sujet, le citoyen, et les autres, c'est-à-dire la communauté, l'ensemble des autres, et qui chacun, donc la libération, viendrait qu'il y a une sorte d'accord constant, c'est ça la révolution spinoziste, et de vérification et de rectification constante du point de vue de l'horizon des uns par rapport aux autres, chacun se prenant mutuellement comme horizon. Voilà, donc c'est un livre qui insiste sur la grande nouveauté de la pensée spinoziste en matière de loi naturelle, puis qui est très informé sur Hobbes, sur Machiavel, donc je ne peux que, évidemment, vous inviter à le lire. Et donc c'est une nouvelle façon, si vous voulez, de reprendre le sujet de Alexandre Materon, individu et communauté chez Spinoza, d'une façon évidemment très différente. Bien, donc après avoir dit donc, quelques mots de ce livre, donc on va vous écouter aujourd'hui, et donc l'exposé aujourd'hui est en anglais, donc, M. Santos Campos comprend le français, donc nous pourrons lui poser les questions en français si on veut ensuite, ou en anglais, ce sera très libre, ce sera tout à fait à votre goût.
Ou en espagnol.
Ou en espagnol, voilà, mais en espagnol, il faudra donner une petite traduction française à ce moment-là, quoi qu'on comprenne l'espagnol aussi, enfin du moins l'espagnol académique. S'il est parlé assez lentement, ça devrait aller.
C'est difficile pour un espagnol.
Ah oui, c'est vrai que l'espagnol, il ne parle pas souvent lentement. Oui. Donc, nous vous écoutons sur le sujet, donc, Mimesis and Time in Spinoza's Practical Philosophy. Donc, mimesis étant dans la philosophie pratique de Spinoza. Donc, un handout a été distribué, tout le monde là, je vais vous apporter le vôtre. Et donc, je vous laisse la place pour un exposé comme vous voulez, et puis après je reviendrai pour la discussion. Donc, vous avez la parole. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, merci de m'avoir invité. C'est pour moi un plaisir, c'est un honneur d'être ici. 11 ans, vous méritez des félicitations parce que c'est très important. Merci très particulièrement au professeur Charles Ramon. Il avait été très gentil de m'avoir invité et spécialement de m'avoir laissé faire ma communication en anglais. Je sais que ce n'est pas habituel dans ce séminaire. Je comprends le français, mais je n'ai la connaissance suffisante de la langue pour présenter ce que je vais dire ici. Et alors je préfère présenter en anglais, c'est la langue plus proche de la façon dans laquelle je pense en philosophie, après le portugais, comme c'est évident. Moving on to English, if I may.
Go ahead.
I'm especially thankful to Professor Ramon and to Hishio Ryu, of course, who first approached me for this particular seminar, because as Professor Ramon so kindly said in the introduction, when he mentioned the dates of my publications on Spinoza, the book he talked about came out firstly in 2012. So only today did I realize, when I was flying in, that it was 13 years ago that I published this book, 13 years ago, so it's a long time. So I did work on Spinoza for quite some time. I published that book in 2012. Then I published some other collective stuff on Spinoza 2 or 3 years afterwards. And then for reasons that are not particularly relevant here, professional and personal, I went on to work on something completely different from early modern political philosophy. So I started working in mainly analytical political theory, especially democratic theory, and most forcefully in these past few years on a particular topic of that area, which is intergenerational justice, which has led my work towards that area and my latest publications on in an area that has absolutely nothing to do with early modern philosophy, much less Spinoza. So, truth be told, I haven't been working on Spinoza for like 7 years now. So this invitation was kind of an opportunity and a challenge for me to come back to Spinoza, something I was looking forward to do, because when you spend that much time working on Spinoza as I did in the past, and then you spend 6 years without working on Spinoza, you miss Spinoza, because you can't just take your Spinozian glasses when you look at the world. They keep attached to your face, and that's something that always, for someone who claims to be a Spinozist, it's always something that is important to get back to Spinoza. So in this particular challenge, in the Séminaire Spinoza, what I wanted to do is getting back to my old Spinoza, that is my 13-year-old Spinoza in that book, Spinoza's Revolutions in Natural Law. I wanted to combine my two main areas of research for the past 15 years. So I wanted to take something from work on intergenerational justice and work on Spinoza to see if they combine in a sense. Although intergenerational justice is kind of a misleading term, because it's more like cross-temporal political theory. It's not necessarily about generations, and it's not necessarily only about justice. It concerns mainly how it is, especially in the realm of political theory or political philosophy, how it is that there's a normative dimension to how whatever it is that we have to say about politics today concerns the future. So it's mainly future regarding, and it's future regarding in a sense that includes what we call the non-overlapping future. That is the future in which there will be people alive who are not alive yet today, and especially in some moment in time in which everybody alive today will be dead. So that area of research concerns how there's might be a normative dimension to thinking about the long-term future in a way that is relevant to political theory today. So that's why people approach the topic of generations, that's why people approach the topic from the perspective of justice, and so on and so forth. Right, so when we look at Spinoza, and what's interesting about this cross-temporal political theory is that we don't see it popping up very much in the history of philosophy. We see it being discussed, being fleshed out mostly at the end of the 18th century, in correspondence between people like Thomas Jefferson, people like Thomas Paine, James Madison, Edmund Burke, and then we see the topic coming up again in the 20th century post-war period, and then we see it again popping up in the late 70s of the 20th century. It's kind of those waves in which the topic appears. In my view, it's probably because, and those are the times in which it seems most prominent that politics can affect a very long-term future in a way that hadn't been experienced before. I mean, if we look at the late 18th century, we see these people working on constitutionalism. That is, they're thinking of drafting constitutions that will last a very long time and will eventually bind people in the future. So that's what's in their hand. That's why they're talking about future generations. In the post-war period, we see the proliferation of nuclear weapons context. So the potential prospects of humanity being able to wipe out humanity, which didn't exist before that particular weaponry was invented. And then in the late 70s, we see it attached more to the environmentalist movements, and climate change comes up in the discussion. So when we're talking about future generations, we're mostly talking about the effects that a problem like climate change may have in the lives of people somewhere in the future due to the action of people in the present or in a recent past. Before we see these three waves, there's not much that comes up in the literature, in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, on thinking specifically on the future or on the long-term future. Especially in systems, in closed systems in philosophy, of course the future pops up every now and then, but it doesn't pop up as something that has a relevant normative dimension that is salient enough to be relevant in terms of defining, structuring political philosophy in the present. And that happens a bit when it comes to Spinoza, so we don't actually have a theory of cross-temporal political theory in Spinoza. But we do have to consider whether something that someone like Spinoza would claim in a systematic philosophy, which is enclosed in a book called The Ethics, which aims at constructing a sort of itinerary of perfection and progression of individuality that leads one to become more productive of nature, whether that has anything relevant to say in terms of temporal related ethical action. So Spinoza is not just concerned about doing a system of philosophy in the ethics. He's not concerned about constructing a morality. He's concerned about describing the path towards perfection available to humans. And that means that the end of the book, in this case the ethics, is the wise man, right? The sage, the one who is able to not only understand what it means to live from the viewpoint of eternity, but actually participate in that productivity that is part of being wise from the perspective of eternity. But this, of course, and Spinoza says it again and again, especially in Ethics 3 and 4, that doesn't mean that the sage man, the wise man, stops being a man. So because he is a man, he has a body, and because he has a body, he is always passive in a sense, and he's always prone to the effects. So he cannot escape affectivity. Affectivity is part of being an individual that is part of natura naturata. This much he says explicitly, especially in Proposition 4 of Ethics 4. So he also says that reason, which he always claims that it's a sort of understanding sub quandam specia eternitatis, from a sort of species of eternity, which is not necessarily bound to time, but it's also not eternal per se, it's something somewhere in between. But reason does not have the power to overrule the effects. So the effects can only be overruled by stronger effects. And he also tells us that the effects are stronger the closer they are to the present of that passivity of the human body. So he tells us this right at the beginning of Ethics 4. The images of things present are stronger than the images of those things in the future or in the past, even if they are closer. And he even claims images of things that are closer in the future are stronger than images of things that are further away in the future. He tells us that in Proposition 10. And then Proposition 14, he says something even more troubling. He says that even the desire, that cupiditas, based on the knowledge of good and evil, that aims for the future, is not strong enough to not being overruled by the desire for things that are immediate in the present. So now we're led to think, okay, maybe this could be a problem for Spinoza in terms of thinking how it is that we can combine this notion of being bound by the effects and the idea that reason is powerless to override the effects that seem to privilege the present and being completely presentist. But the wise man, of course, it seems strange to say that Spinoza's wise man is entirely oblivious to what happens in the future or in the long-term future in problems such as climate change. So what we're looking is I'm looking into whether there can be such a thing as an ethically supported theory of the long term in Spinoza's practical philosophy. But here of course we face these problems. First of all, affectivity seems bound by the now, right? The affects that are stronger are always those that are in the present, in the now, that affect the body now. And reason seems powerless, even if reason is supported by an idea of doing something that's in favor of the far-off future, to override this presentist force of the affects in the now. And if that's the case, how can we think and act beyond the instantaneous of actuality? That's our first problem. So affectivity doesn't allow us to extend our ethical look beyond the present, it seems. So if that would be the case, then our first problem would be that there can be no reasonable way to support a long-term view action in Spinoza's practical philosophy. But then we have a second problem. The second problem is that, okay, maybe if reason is powerless to override the effects, and the effects seem to be presentist, maybe we can solve this by reading the entirety of the ethics and understanding what it means to become eternal, or knowing from the viewpoint in eternity, and knowing through acquiescentia ipso. So we would go eternal. That would be a solution to our first problem. If we go eternal, then there's no point in thinking whether affectivity and reason can support an idea of the long term. But if we go eternal, if that's our point of view, and Spinoza defines eternity in terms of being opposed to duration, that is, we cannot define eternity in terms of duration, and duration is measured by time. And if we think of eternity as a sort of timeless nature of the very existence of God, then how can we conceive the scope of praxis, of action, that is future-oriented, if the very category of future depends on duration, right? It cannot be eternal, because in order to think of future and the present, we need to be stuck in duration. And in order to be future-friendly, it has to be trans-durational. So going eternal wouldn't solve our problem at all. It would just make it even more salient. So what I intend to do in my talk is to try to sidestep these two problems and to show that there is room for thinking of future-oriented praxis in Spinoza's philosophy, and I'll try to do that in three parts, in three sections. First, what I call the categories of duration. That's les catégories de la durée that you can see in the handout. I'll try to explain what I understand by categories of duration, and why they are necessary to understand Spinoza's realm of politics. Then I'll say something about the different kinds of mimesis that are relevant to Spinoza's practical philosophy and how they relate to different temporalities. And then I'll finish by saying something on the temporality of mimesis in Spinoza's political philosophy, if I have the time. So with regard to the categories of duration, so we know Spinoza doesn't have a specified theory of time. In fact, he even seems to belittle time in certain parts of his work, where the letter 12 is the most evident. But we can say that temporality, of course, does end up playing a key role in his philosophy. He talks about time or temporal elements all the time in his work. And mainly we have two categories of temporality. I say temporality here and understood as in a very broad sense, as encompassing both eternity and duration. But eternity should not be mistaken or confused with transcendence, nor is it something beyond or after duration. And duration, in a sense, he uses it quite often as synonymous with time, even though they're not quite synonymous with time, as I will try to say. So at the outset, it might seem tempting to conceive of eternity and duration as conceptual mechanisms that break the temporal. Eternity would seem more perfect than what the temporality of human existence and duration would be. So we will have eternity as perfect and duration as imperfect. The system would introduce a sort of hierarchy between the different ways of conceiving temporality. And letter 12 does seem to lead us in that direction. Spinoza poses eternity to duration, the former infinite and indivisible, the latter divisible as quantity. And in this sense, he claims it is nothing more than an aid to the imagination, like quantity and measure. So time would be simply a measurable unit divided in points of moment, hours, days. It would be pointless then to talk about an objective reality of measurable time, for it is nothing but an image we use in order to be able to relate in an abstract way to the surrounding world. So Spinoza's point in letter 12 seems to be that if we keep trying to understand things according to measurable time, we may hypothetically arrive at a whole of external relations of occurrence, but not at each thing in its singular sense, because we separate this thing from nature or from the whole to which it belongs. The essence of a singular thing cannot be detached from the substance's causality, which is why focusing on time would only show us singular things from an external point of view. So this seems at the outset, especially from letter 12, that we have this hierarchy between eternity and duration. But things are not that simple. That's what I'm aiming at in this section here, on several accounts. First of all, we should bear in mind that duratio and tempus are not necessarily the same thing, right? So duration is an undifferentiated continuum. Time is the quantitative measure of duration, by which the continuum is differentiated, that is cut, right? Second, both kinds of temporality, eternity and duration, are worthy of definitions in the ethics. Eternity in Ethics 1 and duratio in Ethics 2. And both refer to existence, not to essence. This is a very important point. So the upshot of this double dimension of temporality is that for singular things, which is what will be concerned mostly here, because those are the main characters of practical philosophy, there are two kinds of temporal existence. And I quote from the corollary of proposition 8 of Ethics 2. When singular things are said to exist, not only insofar as they are comprehended in God's attributes, but insofar also as they are said to have duration, their ideas also involve the existence through which they are said to have duration. So it seems we have two different kinds of duration by singular things. Duration, or more than duration, two different kinds of existence related to time for singular things. They exist eternally insofar as they are comprehended in God's attributes, and they exist in that sense that they can have duration and they can become actual, have an essentia actualis. So for the realm of praxis, both dimensions of existence matter, and they matter equally for singular things. Third, it is at this double realm of existence that we can develop adequate knowledge where we are active both mentally and physically, c'est-à-dire fully existing. Fourth, the claim that we feel and experience eternity, that Spinoza presents in Ethics 5, suggests that there is more to Spinoza's eternity than just the opposite of duration, and that there is more to duration than just the inadequate way of conceiving causal power within the substance's causa sui. So the wise man is not outside of duration because he can experience eternity, and this experience cannot be detached from the wise man's existence in duration. What this means is that human individuals exist across different temporalities. They express eternity insofar as they are contained in God's self-causation, and they are situated in and cannot exist beyond the precise temporality that is duration. Duration is the milieu of existence for certain and determinate modes. At this level, we can establish in Spinoza what Laurent called, and quite well in my view, une philosophie de la durée. Okay, so if that is the case, what kinds of essences are these for which duration is a milieu? The way I read it now, and I'm just reproducing what I say in one of the chapters in Spinoza's Revolutions and Natural Law. In Natura Naturata, the unit takes center stage, but in the political treatise is a bit different, but we're focusing on the ethics. Spinoza refers to the unit in part 2 by employing 4 different terms, which are usually equated and treated as synonymous in the literature, in the secondary literature. But if we look at the text of Ethics 2, they're not necessarily synonymous. The first is the definition of a finite thing. Finitus, that which can be limited by another of the same nature. The finite arises from the encounter with another similar in kind and results from the clash between different affirmations that end up being also reciprocal negations. This is the sense in which determination is a negation, the expression he uses in letter 50. Another term he uses for that which is called finite is a particular thing. The particular is defined somewhat differently. He calls it, and I quote, "Particular things are nothing but affections of God's attributes or modes by which God's attributes are expressed in a certain or determinate way." End of quote. The particular is the result of God's immanent causality, that is, in the certain modes of the essence of God that makes itself exist by becoming determined. In this particular sense, in the definition of the finite, there is no causal production of anything, only a demarcation of limits, but in the definition of the particular, God's self-causality is already in play. The particular is the affirmation of God's effects, qua certain and determined. Another term, finite particular, is the singular. The singular adds a different and new layer to these terms. Singular things are those, and I quote in definition 7, that are finite and have a determinate existence, end of quote. That is, those things that are finite and particular, but to which a new quality is added. Which quality is that? He tells us so in the very definition. And I quote, "If a number of individuals so concur in one action, that together they are all the cause of one effect, I consider them all, to that extent, as one singular thing." So now that which is finite is not being fleshed out as the result of causality, but as causality itself, whereas the particular was the certain and determinate mode qua effect. Now we have a certain and determinate mode qua cause, right? And a cause within the realm of natura naturata, that is, in the ordo et connexio of the causes among things. In this definition, Spinoza mentions individuals, which seem to be singular things, yet the definition of individual follows after this particular definition, where he mainly in axiom 3 to proposition 13, where he says that individuals, that is corpus compositum, an individual sive corpus compositum. And the definition of the individual is very important to us after lemma 3. And I'll quote it in its entirety because I'm going to need it to stress out what I mean by categories of duration. When a number of bodies, whether of the same or of different size, are so constrained by other bodies that they lie upon one another, or if they so move, whether in the same degree or different degrees of speed, that they communicate their motions to each other in a certain fixed manner, we shall say that those bodies are united with one another, and that they altogether compose one body or individual, which is distinguished from the others by this union of bodies. So what comprises the individual now is this ratio of motion and rest between components. Individuals are now something that is finite, something that is particular, something that is singular, and something else which is an ontological relation of all these layers. So individuals are finite, particular, singular, and they are ontologically relations. That's the ratio in which the individual consists of, and they are in relations. So what I say is that individuals are beings of relation in relation. The strategy of the conatus that we see beginning in Ethics 3 is an itinerary of more and more composition, of more and more parts within an individual unit. So what I'm trying to achieve with this taxonomy, finite, particular, singular, individual, which is cumulative, is that we cannot conceive them as existing qua modifications of the substance, right, God's causality, without specific categories of temporality. I use the word categories, but I'm thinking of a sort of a mental map by which we can make sense of duration, right? That's in the sense I call them categories of duration. Moreau, for instance, calls something similar la dimension mémorielle, or la structure mémorielle, qui organise l'expérience. I think it has something more than just memory, and I'll try to show that, but it's something similar with that. I mean, we can call it categories or aids to the understanding, whatever it is we want to call it. My point is that you need them to make sense of the very existence of individuals. My grounds for this claim are threefold. One is quantity. I will not say much about quantity. It's Professor Ramon's baby talking about quantity. So I'll just, the way I understand quantity is that individuation here takes place by quantifying. I mean, there's no other way around it. So if you need to establish a ratio, a proportion of motion and rest between bodies, you need to quantify that. You need to quantify that particular communication between bodies. The conatos is the essence insofar as it is in itself. Quantum in se est. The quantum that is to be determined in a certain way. Certo et modo determinato. Without the divisibility of quantification, which is a typical characteristic of the measurement that constitutes time, there is no realm of individuality in the first place. Of course, this does not mean that there's no qualitative dimension of power for infinite modes. I'm just saying that you cannot not have a quantitative dimension. So that's my first ground. The second ground is speed or velocity, which is a recurrent theme in Ethics 2. Spinoza's geometrical method displays the mechanics of causality, such as we find it in Galileo, for instance, in which motion plays a key part. And motion relates to objects moving across space at a certain time. Speed is inserted by Spinoza, in addition, in the very definition of the individual. So bodies can be in motion or rest in absolute terms. In relative terms, the opposition translates into speed in motion. Some travel faster and others travel more slowly. Speed is a category of temporality within the very attribute of extension. It tells us how long it takes a body to make a transition from one point to another. So when we say that a body is traveling at 120 kilometers an hour, what that basically means is that from point A to point B, in which the distance from the viewpoint of extension is 120 kilometers, the transition from point A to point B takes an hour. So that's basically what we're saying. We're using a measure of time to measure spatial distance. Even certain terms that we use, such as light years. The star whatsoever is X light years from Earth. That's a measure of space. We're using a temporal category to measure space. Spinoza tells us this connection between speed and time, especially in the scholium to proposition 44 of Ethics 2. That's where he offers the example of the child that sees Peter in the morning, then Paul in midday, and then she sees Simon in the evening, and then in the following day, whenever she sees them, she will connect that image to the point in which the sun was at the moment in which she saw that same person the day before. And if she sees the persons in some third day in another order, there will be some sort of fluctuatio in her memory. Speed there is mentioned as in terms of how it relates to the transition of the sun, and that's how we measure time in terms of speed. But notice how this is different from how speed appears in the definition of the individual. In the definition of the individual, speed is an integral part of the movements that compose the body, and that ultimately will be a determinant factor in maintaining the very ratio of motion and rest that keeps bodily integrity. It's not just that we imagine time as a side effect of our images, deriving from our external relations. It's chiefly that we cannot even conceive of the existence of the individual body without a category that relates to temporality. So this is ground number 2. Ground number 3, well, I don't have much to say about ground number 3, but basically point out an evident fact. Spinoza distinguishes between genres of knowledge quite often by using categories of time, right? So imagination relates to time and duration. Reason relates to the perspective sub quandam specie aeternitatis, and intuitive science relates to eternity, right? So even the genres of knowledge are equated with differences in temporality. So the categories of temporality, which is that which allows the consistency of durational existence for individual things, I identify 3 main categories. And here I draw from Kant's analogies of experience in the Critique of Pure Reason, even though Kant presents them as different schemes of pure concepts of thought. And that's not how I want to use them here. But I want to use them in terms of how it is that we need them in order to make sense of the very existence of individuals in natura naturata. The first is permanence, right? Permanence means the continuation and duration of objective individuals identical to themselves. In order to have a definition of what is clear and determined in nature's causality, that makes a thing singular, individual, and therefore distinct and distinguishable from other things, we need to be sure that the causal relations that integrate the individual and that the individual integrates properly belong to it, to the individual. That is, the individual must remain the same beyond and despite his modifications. In this sense, permanence requires what the philosopher called J.M.E. McTaggart in the beginning of the 20th century called the A series of time, which is basically the division between past, present, and future. When a moment T1 is the present, all previous moments are in the past, and all succeeding moments are in the future. And this is what allows us our idea of flow. And we notice this permanence in Spinoza, or this need for permanence in Spinoza, in three different contexts. The first is in the definition of the individual as a ratio of motion and rest. From T1, a moment in the present, to T2, another moment sometime in the future from duration, something changes in the composite body. And some bodies get out of the composite body, some new bodies enter the composite body. The ratio of motion and rest equates to the permanence of whatever there was in the body at T1 that persists in the body at T2. Whatever this is, and Spinoza tells us what it is the mathematical proportion, which is singular and unique between movements of composite parts. That is what allows us to say that we have the same body at moment T1 and at moment T2. It's not just a similarity between two different bodies, it is a characteristic of the existence of both bodies, and therefore they are both the same body at different moments of duration. The third context is the theory of the konatos, right? So in order to persevere in being, perseverance requires repetition of existence in different fractions in which we may divide duration. Especially if we look at cupiditas, which is a striving to remain in being along with consciousness of that striving. It's not simply a consciousness of striving, but a consciousness of what it is we are striving to remain as, to remain in being. In becoming conscious of one's striving to remain in being, one must form an idea of what kind of thing one is qua individual, that is, qua a certain and determined expression of God's causality, as opposed to other certain and determined expressions of God's causality. Consciousness is thus the idea of the singularity and distinctiveness of that which is essential and common to the bodies at T1 and T2 that make it the same body. The third context is the definition of the effects. Spinoza uses the categories of the A series quite a lot, especially for effects such as fear and hope, confidence and despair, gladness and remorse. There are always some uncertainty regarding the future or regarding the past. So Spinoza needs these categories of the A series in order to make sense of these very effects. And there's very important effects, especially for political theory, as we will see later on in the political treatise. The second category of duration is sequence, connection. Ordo et concatenatio, he says. Duration is not simply divisible as opposed to eternity. There has to be a connection between whatever is divided in duration in such a way that allows us to understand nature's causality operating within that divisibility. Causality plays a key role in the realm of singular existence and follows a specific order from cause to effect rather than the other way around. So something is the cause of an effect and that is not reversible. This does not mean that the order is necessarily chronologically. It is mostly logical and methodological. Causa seu ratio, says Spinoza. The cause does not have to pre-exist the effect, but the cause is presupposed for the existence of the effect and therefore generates the effect. There is always some sort of anteriority and posteriority or ulteriority in duration. And anterior is a word that pops up several times in the ethics. What this means is that the equation of both bodies at moment T1 and moment T2 that allows to identify the same body at both moments does not allow us to arrange both moments arbitrarily. We need the existence of individuals to follow a mandatory path in order that they are not randomly distributed back and forth in each separation of finite modifications of the substance. We need one to follow the other and the other to not reverse its position. So sequence means irreversibility. T2 must follow T1 and that is not reversible. So that is what the concatenatio means. The concatenatio itself cannot be reversed. Order is therefore necessary. If A precedes B, B cannot precede A, even if perhaps we perceive B before we perceive A. Sequence has this compulsory character of irreversibility. In this sense, sequence requires what G.M.E. McTaggart calls not the A series of time, but the B series of time. Where the B series, he says, is determined not in terms of past, present, and future, but in terms of earlier than and later than. So if we set any moment in time, we can always say that there is something earlier than that moment and after that moment. And that is not reversible. Something that is, someone that is born before someone else will always remain someone that is older than that someone else. You cannot reverse that. Whereas in the past, present, future series, that is reversible, right? That which is present was the future in the past and is bound to become the past in the future. The moment is always changing in terms of its category in the A series. Spinoza also needs the B series in order to make sense of the sequence. The third category is simultaneity. The word simul, which Spinoza uses so many times, quite often to identify even the attributes which are called simul, not in the terms that they are parallel. I think the literature has passed the parallelism theory, but in terms that they equate. But the word he uses to equate is simul. They're at the same time. They're kind of the same thing in the same moment. Simul means that the external relationship in terms of temporality between individuals can be merely causal, in the sense that one individual affects another individual as an effect, and in this external relation we have a one-way street. But what Spinoza calls the common order of nature is an order in which individuals not only enter into causal relations with other individuals, but one in which individuals enter into causal relations with each other. It is not enough for individual A to have a causal relationship with an individual B. It also happens that the individual B has a causal relationship with the individual A. And here we have a scope of reciprocity in the very order and concatenatio. And reciprocity requires the possibility of simultaneity. Simultaneity means indifference to any order in the relationship between singular things, and this regardless of the fact that singular things do relate to each other in sequence. In this sense, simultaneity requires compressing the A series into one single temporal landscape. Existence becomes coexistence within a sort of instantaneous now. Two bodies exist in the same moment. Right? And by coexisting, both individuals are determined towards each other not only as negation, as we see in letter 50, but also as reciprocally setting each other's position in time. Coexistence implies that the individual participation in duration is always relative to some other participation in duration. I exist in this room now, and I determine this now in light of all the other things that coexist in this room now with me, including each and every one of you. Right? This is the sense in which we can be said to coexist in the same moment, in duratio, in the same room right now, in terms of natura naturale. For that, we need the category of simultaneity. So what this triptych implies, these three categories. One is that they are cumulative. The second is that temporality is not an attribute, nor can it be, but the categories are necessary in order to make sense of what happens in natura naturata among individuals. This sounds strange to say because time is an aid to the imagination, as Spinoza calls it in letter 12. And the imagination mistakes necessity for contingency, right? That's the very part of what it does. But although it is true that imagination consists in precisely that, it is subject to the laws of nature just as much as the physical world. So the ideas that it generates results from the receptivity of the mind, but this does not mean that such ideas do not constitute the synthesis of the multiplicity of affections, whether through the integrative processes of memory or through general and abstract notions such as time, number, and measure. Appearance is the necessary feature nature of the representation of the encounter of external bodies with the body that is affected. So there's no other way of knowing the actual essence of such bodies other than through the kind of knowledge by which the mind expresses for itself the laws of integration of individuals into the totality of the universe. Representations arise in the imagination as appearances from the passivity of the mind, but the mind articulates all this data, appearances or ideas of understanding, in the same way and with the same logical necessity found in the causal order of things. So the categories of temporality are inherent in this necessity of the imagination. And that is in the sense in which I call it a sort of second degree attribute attached to the attribute of extension. How long do I have left? How long? Combien de temps?
Il faut laisser au moins une demi-heure, une grosse demi-heure.
Demi-heure.
Vous avez encore...
Oui. Merci.
20 minutes.
20. Okay, thank you. I'll divide, I'll try to... I spoke too much in the first section. I'll try to shorten my second. My
for the way now. Huh?
The paper is too long, so I'll go through some of it in the section 2, so I can still cover section 3, which without section 3, it doesn't make sense. The answer to the tentative answer to the first problem. So. Of course, the realm of praxis. Now I move on to my second section, the different kinds of mimesis and how it relates to temporalities. The realm of praxis is the realm of action that is necessarily also affective. Of course, we know that from Ethics 3 and Ethics 4. So my point here is that praxis that expresses nature to the highest degrees requires affinities, different kinds of commonalities, and these affinities have different temporalities. So I call them mimesis as a way of understanding similarity. And I divide mimesis in Spinoza in 3 different kinds of mimesis. One is the imitation, which we know from the imitation of effects. The other I call mirroring, and the third one I call reproducing. The imitation, we know that imitation, the imitation of the effects, which is defined especially at proposition 27 of Ethics 3, we know that it obeys to the laws of the conatus. So it involves similarity, or the idea of something being similar, and of somehow copying that which is imagined as similar, insofar as there is no remembrance of any other contact with that which is imagined as similar. But what is this similarity? Spinoza tells us that some bodies agree, convenire, he says, in nature with others, whereas they may have a contrary nature to others. We can break down similarity here to a few characteristics. One, it involves duality, that is duplication. It requires divisibility in the substance. The substance itself is infinite and indivisible. There is nothing that can be similar to it. So there is no mimesis of the substance, because the substance is unique. So because there is no duality in the substance, imitation or mimesis can only occur within duality, and that happens only in natura naturata. And once a division is completed, whatever we find in one fraction or part of the division is found also in the other fraction or part. And this dual existence in more than one part of fraction does not convert into the unit of persistence. So it is not identical in the sense that they have the same identity. So they remain strictly coexistence. They're not the same thing. The second point is that this duplication is integral. It is not a duplication merely of certain characteristics, but of the very components of the essentia actualis. So it's duplication at the ontological level, in a sense. This is the sense in which it is also duplication of power, of potentia agendi, insofar as the essence equates to the individual's power. And this also means that duplication plays a key role at the level of praxis. Third, duplication occurs within the scenario of causality, that is, involving beings of relation, in relation, individuals, and categories of anteriority and succession, as we saw before. One duplicates the other and vice versa. Fourth, because of this, the starting point does not have to be actual duplication, only the image of duplication, an appearance of duplication. In order for imitation to occur, all that has to happen is that someone forms an image of similarity of the other towards oneself. Now, if we add the theory of conatus to these characteristics of similarity, we obtain the mechanism of mimesis in the effects, the imitation of the effects. We know, Spinoza tells us, that each governs everything from his effect. The decision of the mind, the decretum, this he says in the scholium to proposition 2 of Ethics 3, the decretum, the appetite, the determination of the body, determinatio, are one and the same thing. He uses the word simul once again here. However, governing everything from one's effect, when in reciprocal relations in which bodies determine themselves based on similarity or on the image of similarity, each conatus leads to imitation. One's effect equates then with the image of another's effect. For this image of similarity to be generated, the conatus requires the presence of the body's affection. This is a key term for us, presence. Spinoza uses it again and again. Presence is necessary to determine the nature of the body that decides and acts, even in imitation. It does not have to be actual presence, but imagined presence. Memory takes the image present. The mind contemplates as present the external bodies. So, and that happens, for instance, in love, and in Spinoza's definition of love. Whoever loves strives to have as present that which he loves. So my point here is that presence can only be made clearer with regard to the categories of duration. The imitation of the effects requires presence, and in order to understand presence, we need the categories of duration. We need simultaneity. The image of that which is imitated coexists in a single fraction of duration with the imitator. We need the category of sequence, because duality is not the starting point. Presence is constructed from the way the body is affected. There has to be a process of presentification that offers the conditions of imitation, in this case, the B series. And the now, the A series, boils down to the present. Anything past or future is, of course, not relevant from the point of the effects, except if it is there as a present image of a thing past or future. So even the images of things in the future or things in the past are images that are there in the present. Right? So we have present images conflicting with each other, and usually the images of those things present that relate to things that are indeed present are stronger than the present images of things that are related in the future. The upshot, the imitation of the effects, is presentist, instantaneous, and volatile. It depends on the now. I have two examples of specific cases of imitation that are not necessarily so. I don't think I have the time to go into them. One is the case of emulatio, right? Emulation, Spinoza says, that which we distinguish it from imitation insofar as it is that which we are used to associating to imitating something that is we judge to be honorable or useful or pleasant. This he says in the definition of the effects, 33. So emulation is different from imitation, but it's not different from imitation on account of causality. Emulation is an effect, which imitation is not defined as an effect. But emulation is based on value judgment, so it's not real, it's only the way we are used to conceive it. And imitation of desire, which he presents in proposition 27 of Ethics 3, involves also this duality, that we imagine a thing like us. And it's not just any desire, but a desire connected to value judgment, to that which is useful, to that which is regarded as pleasant. And this, of course, is a product of the imagination. So emulation can have a strong role to play at the level of praxis, and here is where we can connect Spinoza's thinking on emulatio with René Girard's work. I will not go into it because that's another paper in itself. My point is that emulation, when it connects to proposition 32, that is when imitation is imitation of the desire of someone else for something. It's not just emulation of that which is good or that we admire in the person, is emulation of that or the imitation of that desire, which is a desire to something that cannot be shared. And when that happens, and it happens a lot in political contexts, and it happens in intergenerational contexts as well, such as the environment, we have conflict rather than cooperation. So in this sense, the emulatio has a temporality of itself that leads as much to cooperation than to conflict. The second example of imitation is the case of prescriptive conceptions of the good, or what I call the architecture of prescription in my book, Spinoza's Revolutions in Natural Law. I go into different categories of how we can understand prescription, and I say that they're all products of the imagination. All rules are comprised of a certain structure that is the product of the imagination. But all rules contain an idea of a good. They say something that should be done, and that something is grounded on an idea that that which should be done is something good, and the opposite is something bad. But this is a product of the imagination. But in a sense, it's also an exercise of mimesis, because you're supposed that the person who is supposed to observe or comply with the law is supposed to reproduce or imitate the idea of the person who complies with the idea of good that is embedded in the very notion of the rule. Mimesis can only be mirroring, as I said. The realm of affectivity, I'll just mirroring, I say, relates to reason. Of course, Spinoza in the preface to Ethics 4, he says that good and bad are just aids to the imagination insofar we compare things among themselves. But he also says that we should keep this terminology. He wants to show what the effects have that is good or bad. So he claims that joy is not directly bad, but good, that there's a supreme good of those who seek virtue. He mentions that such terminology should be preserved, and he explains why. Because he is looking to form a model of human nature, the exemplar. That's the word he uses in the preface to Ethics 4. So good here is not presented as something absolute, but as an instrument for increasing power. So it's not a provisional, timeless morality. If man is led to establish models of a good life, that's because he is following even then an impulse inherent in his nature as a being of desire. The exemplar does not constitute a value that transcends the order of facts and imposes itself on them, nor does it constitute a principle conceivable in the abstract. It is a figure in the horizon towards which the path of the conatus is directed. So it is generated by reason rather than by the imagination, and therefore beyond the variations of time. The process is similar to that of the good embedded in the prescriptive laws, but this time is a complete rational construction, whereas in the prescriptive laws it was a complete imaginative construction. But of course, Spinoza's wise man, he knows that he can set his eyes on the exemplar, but he is always attached or bound to affectivity. So what he needs to do is to somehow orient his affectivity in a way that helps mirroring the exemplar without ever rationally knowing that he can entirely embody that which the exemplar says is acting solely through adequate ideas. So this is the sense in which the exemplar can also be an object of mimesis, of mirroring. It is somewhat immune to the categories of duration, but whatever fits into these categories can duplicate the exemplar. The action that follows from who understands through adequate ideas is the mimesis of the actions that reason can deduce from the exemplar. So the exemplar is the product of ratio, and therefore mirroring is the mimesis that is particular of reason. The third type of mimesis is what I call reproducing. Of course, that is knowing through scientia intuitiva, what I call going eternal earlier. This form of eternity, and I'm not going into the question of what the nature of eternity is, whether it equates with sempiternity or whether it's just equates with necessity, or whether it is complete timelessness in the sense that it has no relation whatsoever with time. I do think that it has certain relation with time, but I will not go into it. My point here is that the acquiescencia that arises from knowing and knowing intentively means or implies experiencing existence from the viewpoint that is not determined by duration. So the practical implications of this knowledge are not simply self-regarding. They are about acknowledging one's place in nature's self-causality. So it's understanding one's empowerment with others. And this understanding is part of one's process of empowerment or individuation. So eternity, and I quote from André Tossel here, I think it's a very good quote, n'est rien d'autre que la nécessité de sa propre individuation morphologique, comprise à la fois comme résultat et comme principe pour un nouveau commencement. So l'éternité est la nécessité comprise du processus d'éternisation qui a pour résultat le sage. But this sage, this wise man, is not simply the result, but also a new beginning, recommencement, says Tossel. This is because being wise, être de sage, entails reproduction. That is, la reproduction effective du processus naturel qu'il produit. So this process can only take place with others. And it's about putting yourself in the other's position and questioning what the other is going through. It's not simply about making one's own individuality echo throughout eternity, but above all, about making eternity echo in one's individuality by living the reality of the eternal with and in the other. Reproducing consists in making oneself a conscious agent of God's very immanent causality in natura naturata, c'est-à-dire in the order of relations with others. Of course, none of this is very helpful in the political realm. Moving on to our third and final section. The first words of the political treatise is affectus. So it's an entire treatise of the effects. We can talk about the role of reason, but reason only makes sense if we frame it within the context of the effects rather than the other way around. And just as duration is a necessity for individuals, for finite modes, it is also the milieu of politics. Right? But if effects are presentist, in the sense that we discussed before, if they are inconstant, as Spinoza says, one minute they lead us here, the other minute they lead us there. Spinoza's analogy is very beautiful in the Scholium to Proposition 59 of Ethics 3. He says they're like waves in the sea driven by contrary winds. Like waves in the sea driven by that is the sea that they go one way, then they go another way, and this happens one moment after the other. How if politics is the realm of effects and effects are like that, how can effects do anything resembling politics for the long term? Because you never know what the effects will point towards in the following moment. So the most obvious answer, if we look at the TTP, is the contract mechanism. All right, we look at the contract provides this unit. We have a fiat, we contract here and now for the future, and that endures for all time. That was kind of what the constitutionalists of the late 18th century were thinking about when they were talking about future generations in the context of constitution making. Now we're going to make a law that will outlast us for several generations. But of course, even in the TTP, that's not very reasonable, because even in the TTP, unlike Hobbes's contract mechanism, Spinoza already says that the contract mechanism is built by the effects, and those effects always lead us one way or another, depending on the moment. So the contract endures as long as the effects push the contract to being useful for those that are the contracting parties, and that usefulness is determined by the effects. So the contract will not provide us that response. In the ethics, we don't find the contract, we find the imitation of the effects, and here comes even the same problem again. And then in the scholium 2 to proposition 37, in Ethics 4, Spinoza says that, of course, no effect can be restrained except by an effect stronger than and contrary to the effect to be restrained. And everyone refrains from doing harm out of timidity regarding a greater harm. So that means effects can be restricted in two ways: by repressing, coercitio, effects, by providing the conditions for stronger opposing effects to arise, and by timidity. What is timidity? Timidity, Spinoza defines it, a desire, cupiditas, to avoid a greater evil which we fear by a lesser evil. Fear insofar as a man is disposed by it to avoid an evil he judges to be future by encountering a lesser evil. That's the definition he presents in the scholium to proposition 39. So the imitation of someone else's desire becomes the desire of someone else's desire, and each person simultaneously strives to fulfill the image of the other's desire in an effective strategy of fear that starts from the uncertainty of great harm to guarantee the sure of a small damage, discovering the insecurity with a protective safety cover. Security and insecurity, they're related to fear and hope. That is, they're always relying on doubt and on doubt concerning the future. The same emphasis on fear and hope appears in the political treatise. But in the political treatise, we see a new character popping up, right? That hadn't really popped up before. It's the multitude. So this communion produced by the simultaneity of effects that mirror each other allows Spinoza to speak of a common effect. That's the expression he uses in the first paragraph of chapter 6 of the political treatise. And thus Spinoza once again refers to fear and hope as common, to which he adds the desire to avenge a common injury. Fear and hope are also the mechanisms by which Spinoza defines being alterius iuris in chapter 10, in paragraph 10 of chapter 2, which ultimately leads to the conclusion that the same effects that help to constitute the multitude and make each member of the many sui juris are exactly the same that make each member of the many alterius iuris with regard to the other members. Fear and hope and timidity. And remember those effects that are defined by resorting to the A series of time, dependent on the categories of duration. But in the TP and in the political treatise, we have two problems. First is relying on this interplay of effects generates instability. The mechanism that produces the multitude is the same that causes its dissolution. So the body politic is, while it is formed, is always formed with the specter of its own dissolution, as if it were breathing down its neck. And the second Spinoza tells us explicitly in paragraph 5 of chapter 7, the multitude cannot make speedy decisions, timely decisions. Whenever pressing matters need to be decided now, the multitude cannot make them. You need some sort of unit to break down the possibly continuous presentation of opinions by the multitude. So you need someone to become the argument stopper that says, okay, we stop these presentation of opinions by the multitude, and this converts into one decision that needs to be made now. Basically, the multitude just takes too long to decide on stuff, that needs to be decided now. And that's a problem for the multitude. So the most effective way, if that's the case, multiplicity must be suspended in order to make timely decisions. So the most effective way to overcome this instability and for man to reason their way out of the continuous sequence of imitated effects. But of course, not all men are guided by reason, and much less is politics guided by reason. Men are guided mostly by the passions, and yet they still live in political societies. The way to make the multitude's consensus endure must entail a specific orientation of the continuous succession of effects experienced by men. The multitude, once flashed into existence, must ensure the permanent reproduction of the effective moments of its very genesis. That is, it cannot allow for contrary and stronger effects to overcome men's minds. The only way to ensure this is by projecting its own reproduction in terms of the effects. The key to stabilization entails a continuous renovation of the intensity of those unstable effects that brought about the multitude's productivity in the first place. The multitude is able to endure and become persistently powerful when it organizes itself in a way that forces each and every human individual to repeat virtually the effective experience of the multitude's first appearance. So how is this effected? Once commonality flashes into existence, each man's relation with others must reproduce the first human encounter without endangering the commonality's permanence. The way to achieve this is to relate to the entire remaining multitude as if it were in the position of the first human other. Man depicts in his mind the image of the desire he began to imitate, and he imputes it to this new image that he now depicts of the rest of the multitude. And this can only occur when the image each man depicts of the remaining others is indeed one image, not a multiplicity and a continuous sum, but a unity endowed with a tremendous power. The multitude is then organized into the minds of each of its participants under an image of unity, and it is precisely this relation each man establishes with the image of the powerful many that makes him reproduce the effects that allow for the multitude's continuous regeneration. There is an imaginatively productive veil of unity impending on the multiplicity of individual powers. Spinoza calls it potestas, which is exercised under one unique structure he calls the imperium. You can call it the state if you want. Jean-Paul Coujoux says that the state is the condition, la condition de l'actualisation de l'essence de l'individu dans la durée. The imperium is sort of the condition that supports the categories of duration, and that's partially where I'm getting at here. So the unity conferred by imperium confers constancy. But on the contrary, constancy is conferred by the imposition of a model of necessity that at least mitigates the belief in its contingency or mere possibility. The imperium engenders its infinite duration by structuring itself in accordance with the means of natural inscription of an individual, that is, by giving itself an image of being individual by necessity. It is in the search for an infinite duration that overcomes the inconstancy of the multitude that the imperium calls upon itself, what Nicolas Israel has termed the power of temporalization. So he says that this power of temporalization allows states to actually achieve the status of eternity. I won't go that far, I don't think that's the case. But this pouvoir de temporalisation, it's precisely that, is that the potestas involves something that relates to that means you can shape the very way we understand duration. It's the political engendering of temporal forms. So the imperium must constantly provide itself with laws which are free from the passionate whim of the holders of the imperium and provide minimal stability to power. The multitude exercises power through institutions, which are the head and vehicles of the unified will of the people. How I won't go into the how. I've been speaking too long. Let me just conclude. So the upshot of this, in which you can read in the handout. 1. Political institutions provide the backbone of constancy. They can extend their decision-making capacity beyond a single individual's lifetime. That's a key element for us and the problem we're trying to solve. 2. Political institutions depend on the power of the multitude. So even if they are the backbone of constancy, they are not themselves constant. 3. They reinforce their own power by fueling the very process in the multitude that generates them in the first place. They reenact the conditions whereby the members of the multitude require institutions, namely fear and hope and timidity. And we know that those are effects that require categories of duration. We saw that earlier. 4. Spinoza's politics is capable of integrating a long-term view, but cannot but be presentist in a sense, because it relies on the effects. It contains an extended present insofar as it is dependent on affectivity that requires institutions with different time frames than individuals, but a present nevertheless. 5. Spinoza's political philosophy is ever more effective in extending its power of temporalization by fostering the conditions for individual freedom. Not Spinoza's political philosophy. Politics as understood by Spinoza is more effective in extending its power of temporalization by fostering the conditions for individual freedom, where citizens can learn to know by exercises of reason and intuitive science. So yes, we have a presentist, a kind of practical philosophy, but one that can reenact those presentist effects that allow for some sort of constancy and continuity. That seems like the only way in which the realm of relations with others and that requires politics can, within the categories of mimesis, somehow transform itself into a power of temporalization, a chrono power, so to say. And here I rest. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this very striking.
Vous pouvez parler en français.
Je vais parler en français, but je voulais parler un peu en anglais, donc tant pis, vous me frustrez. It was very impressive and really interesting.
Vous êtes affecté par mon usage de l'anglais.
By mimesis, I'm obliged to speak English now. But as you perfectly put it, you understand French, so I am making my speech in French for now. Oui, merci beaucoup pour cet exposé. Malheureusement, vous nous avez laissé peu de temps pour la discussion. Je vais essayer d'être très bref et de laisser la parole tout de suite, mais je veux quand même dire un certain nombre de choses. Bon, d'abord, effectivement, en vous écoutant, je me refaisais une espèce de généalogie du spinozisme. Et c'est vrai que quand on voit Spinoza, quand on lit Spinoza, et quand on lit les commentateurs de Spinoza, on a l'impression qu'il y a comme deux Spinoza. Il y aurait le Spinoza de l'éternité et le Spinoza de la durée. Et simplement, et ça donnait lieu à des affrontements entre les commentateurs. Alors le Spinoza de l'éternité a toujours fasciné non seulement les philosophes, mais aussi les écrivains, tous les hommes de science, etc. Donc, sub specie aeternitatis, c'est la formule de Spinoza. Je vois les choses sous l'aspect de l'éternité. Et puis le sage, c'était celui qui, d'une certaine façon, accédait à l'éternité. Et vous avez mentionné Alquier, merci, c'est un livre très important. Et donc, il y avait une espèce, de mystique spinoziste de l'éternité, et parce que l'éternité était devenue comme quelque chose de presque surhumain, le sage, de presque un surhomme. Et puis de l'autre côté, on avait quand même persévéré dans l'être. Persévérer dans l'être. Persévérer, c'est bien continuer à exister. Et donc là, on a tout un Spinoza de la durée, alors qu'il se manifeste dans tous les domaines du spinozisme, puisque c'est persévérer à quoi est-ce qu'on reconnaît une idée adéquate ou un bon raisonnement? Eh bien, Spinoza dit c'est un raisonnement qui peut persévérer, c'est-à-dire continuer. Il ne rencontre pas d'obstacles, alors qu'un mauvais raisonnement va s'interrompre lui-même. Donc, la poursuite, la persévérance dans l'être était une qualité du raisonnement lui-même, mais elle était aussi une qualité plus générale, c'est-à-dire la qualité de quelque chose qui est bien constitué. Une bonne santé, une vie longue, un mariage qui dure, et par mariage on peut entendre toute espèce d'association, puisque tout l'univers selon Spinoza est constitué de contrats qui se sont passés sans contrat, c'est-à-dire par exemple le contrat par lequel les cellules de votre corps se sont assemblées. Il n'y a jamais eu de contrat prononcé, il n'y a pas eu de contrat cellulaire, si je veux dire. Donc, mais si cette société de cellules est bien constituée, vous allez vivre longtemps. Et d'ailleurs, Spinoza dit à la fin, dans les dernières pages de l'éthique, dans les dernières lignes de l'éthique, le sage ne cesse jamais d'être. Nunquam esse desinit. Il ne cesse jamais d'être. Et là, on peut très bien interpréter cette phrase selon l'ancienne tradition qui voulait que les sages vivaient très vieux, parce que leur corps était bien constitué. Et ce qu'on dit là d'un homme, on peut aussi bien le dire d'un corps politique. C'est-à-dire qu'on voit Spinoza tout au long de sa carrière se diriger de plus en plus vers l'idée qu'au fond, la perfection d'un corps politique, c'est-à-dire d'une cité, s'apprécie exactement comme celle d'un homme, d'un corps, une chose singulière, ou comme celle d'un raisonnement. C'est-à-dire il pourra durer. Et la notion de durabilité est vraiment absolument le centre du traité politique, puisque Spinoza veut construire absolument des régimes durables. Et il emploie tout le temps le mot, et il veut que rien ne puisse les renverser. Et même quand il parle de l'aristocratie au chapitre 10, où il explique que l'aristocratie, avec plusieurs villes importantes, telle qu'il l'a constituée, est tellement durable que, dit-il, elle va être éternelle. C'est comme s'il refaisait le chemin de la durabilité vers l'éternité. Alors, cette double phase du spinozisme, une mystique de l'éternité déjà dénoncée par Alquier dans son premier livre, et puis ensuite, au contraire, une prise en compte de la durée des choses, pourrait faire dire, enfin, cette idée m'est venue en vous écoutant, qu'on pourrait appliquer à Spinoza la très célèbre phrase qu'on avait attribuée à Platon, bien qu'en fait que Platon ne l'ait jamais prononcée, et où il disait, on disait que Platon disait que le temps est l'image mobile de l'éternité. Et chez Spinoza, on aurait un peu de ça, bizarrement. C'est-à-dire, vous vivez longtemps, votre politique est à long terme, vos raisonnements se poursuivent, eh bien, vous manifestez d'une certaine façon l'éternité par votre... En tout cas, vous manifestez déjà votre rationalité et le fait que vous êtes bien construit, bien constitué. Et donc, ce que je veux dire par tout cela, c'est que je pense qu'on peut réconcilier de façon assez facile, finalement, le Spinoza de l'éternité et celui de la durée, au lieu de les opposer, comme parfois les meilleurs interprètes, comme Pierre-François Moreau ou Jacquet, les ont opposés. Et à mon avis, on peut au contraire les rapprocher, parce que l'éternité telle que l'entendait Spinoza, je crois, c'était une éternité beaucoup plus simple et beaucoup plus commune, beaucoup plus pragmatique d'une certaine façon que ce mysticisme inaccessible. L'éternité spinoziste, c'est tout simplement le fait de sortir du temps. Et quand est-ce qu'on sort du temps? On sort tout le temps du temps, dès qu'on fait un raisonnement mathématique. Donc c'était le modèle mathématique, les mathématiques qui n'ont pas de temporalité. Vous faites des mathématiques, vous écrivez More Geometrico, vous êtes dans l'éternité. Tout le monde peut faire ça, c'est très facile. Donc il y avait une réconciliation possible entre le Spinoza de l'éternité qu'on pouvait faire descendre aux mathématiques et le Spinoza de la durée qu'on pouvait faire monter presque à une durée si grande qu'elle touchait, pour ainsi dire, à l'absence de durée. Et donc, moi, je pense que c'est une chose qu'on pourrait faire, ça serait réconcilier ces deux visions du spinozisme. En tout cas, c'est une pente que j'essaye de suivre. Alors, bon, ça, c'était mon exposé. Et maintenant, je vais passer aux questions. Donc, moi, la première question que je poserai, après je vous laisse la parole, bien sûr, c'est: j'ai été particulièrement intéressé par votre introduction et par votre conclusion, c'est-à-dire cette idée, au fond, d'une politique à long terme. Et alors, ce que j'aimerais que vous disiez, peut-être, mais dites-le en anglais, hein, c'est pas un problème, pourquoi cette question vous intéresse tant? Enfin, je veux dire, parce que la politique, finalement, est-ce que c'est pas toujours à long terme? On ne vit pas très vieux, les hommes politiques sont élus, puis sont chassés, s'en vont, si vous voulez, les élections se succèdent les unes aux autres. La politique, pourquoi est-ce que vous voulez absolument introduire cette considération du long terme dans la politique et chez Spinoza? Pourquoi? C'est ça que j'ai... Allez-y.
Je réponds en anglais.
Oui, speak English, please. Do yourself a favor.
Well, the promptness is by especially not in the last few decades, by the climate change literature. So the point is that we need to come up with instruments in the climate change literature. So that's the idea that they're following, is we need to come up with instruments to be implemented today, the benefits of which we're not going to see until 40 or 50 years from now. But they cost a huge amount of money today. Now that a huge amount of money needs to be paid by people today, but they won't live to see the benefits of that which they are generating. So that means you have a trade-off politically. You need people to sacrifice themselves, in a sense, today in order to generate benefits to people who don't even exist. So how do you convince people to do that? One way is that you just don't convince them, and there's no way to generate a climate change political action. Another way is, let's try to come up with ways that are normatively robust, that there's moral reasons to do so, that somehow support this sort of politics in one sense, and then let's try to come up with political instruments that we can add to today's political structures, mostly in democracies, that would make that happen. Okay, and then we have all this literature, that an entire field of literature that followed from these two impulses, from these two motivations. But and not just literature. Several countries have already implemented, for instance, adding future generations to their constitutions. There are more than 80 constitutions in the world that have references to future generations. They have implemented certain institutions like an ombudsman, especially for future generations and future people, and so on and so forth. But then what's interesting about those institutions, and there are several of them, is that there are several books and papers that list them all. In Israel, in Hungary, in Finland, in Canada, there's a lot of them that have been implemented. In Wales, there was a new one that was supposed to be created, in Scotland, but it didn't turn out. But they all disappeared after 5 or 6 years. That's very interesting, because the very institutions that are specifically aimed at the very long term, they're short term. So even people in the long-term literature, they can't solve this problem. This is the main problem. You can't make stable institutions aimed at generating stable policies. Right, so this is my interest area. Now, why looking at Spinoza here?
Yeah,
well, precisely because of this. But Spinoza tries to find a way in his political works to establish some form of stability in a realm of instability, when he knows that instability can never be overruled. Right, so that's the Machiavellian Spinoza, and that's the non-Hobbesian Spinoza. You can never overrule the passions; they're always there. So you know that there's always the specter for instability. Instability and conflict are always part of the body politic and the political community. So the whole point of generating a political philosophy that takes the effect seriously is to try to rearrange them politically in a way that makes them stable. That is, without overcoming conflict, without overcoming instability, which is always there, we can still generate stability within that particular disorder of things. We can establish an order in that which always pulls towards disorder. And that's something that only Spinoza and perhaps Machiavelli does. But Machiavelli didn't have a systematic philosophy like Spinoza does. So Spinoza is like, it seems to me like our main source to look at a very specific systematic philosophy that may offer us some help to try to find a way to generate stability when we know that instability is always there. So you can never get rid of instability and conflict by generating a contract that produces unity and harmony and so on and so forth. You just have to take what you have, that inconstancy, that being pulled this way or that way, that which people in the literature call short-termism, always thinking of the short-termism. You can take the short-term and arrange it in a way that becomes stable, indirectly long-term. So that's the way in which I find inspiration in Spinoza for this. Spinoza is able to generate in his political theory, in his political philosophy, because he needs, in order to produce that, he needs elements from mimesis. He needs a theory of the effect. He needs a theory of duration. Spinoza can offer us the tools to understand that we cannot get rid of short-termism, because that is the way the effects work. But we can order them politically in a way that they can somehow not become that short-termist. Right? If you keep reproducing the same thing over and over and over again and expect that to be reproduced over and over again, you can expect that in the long run, whatever it is you have now will continue to exist, even if you can't really generate a politics towards the future. The only thing that you can do is to reinstate the presentist forms of the effects that you have.
Moi, c'est clair. J'aurais des choses à répondre, mais c'est plus à moi de parler. Donc, si vous avez des questions à notre... oui, Mario Donoso, oui.
Merci beaucoup, André. J'aurais beaucoup de questions, mais j'aimerais juste, parce qu'on n'a pas le temps, poser une question par rapport à ce que vous venez de dire. Comment vous pensez ces rapports avec les générations futures, un rapport politique, surtout créer une stabilité politique. Spinoza essaie de penser dans le traité théologico-politique. Et moi, j'étais en train de penser, je vous lance la question comme ça, j'étais en train de penser à la compassion ou la pitié. Enfin, vous n'avez pas parlé.
Non.
Vous avez parlé de l'émulation, mais pas de la pitié. Je me demande pourquoi. Et je me demande pourquoi on ne pourrait pas penser à une pitié avec ces gens qu'on ne connaît pas, qui n'existent pas, qui vont peut-être arriver un jour, et qui vont trouver un monde qu'on a détruit. Et donc, on pense en termes de compassion ou de pitié, ou, ce qui intéresse le plus, d'indignation, comme on trouve dans les traités politiques, comme un moteur, tout en partant de la mimesis, de la limitation, de l'instabilité affective, un moteur pour penser une institution, un impérium qui dure dans le temps. Je ne sais pas, ça pourrait marcher.
Oui, merci. Yes, you can do that. Of course you can do that. You can have a powerful image of someone in the far off future that provokes pity, and that is an impulse, a sufficient impulse to generate something that's aimed at the long term. In fact, all these institutions that I just mentioned in Hungary and in Israel, and they seem to do exactly just that. They have an image of something in the future, they pity those people in the future, and so they are prompted effectively by pity to doing something to aid people in the future. But Proposition 14 of Ethics 4, when a desire of things in the present conflicts with a desire, even if it's based on knowledge of good and evil, for things in the future, if they conflict, the desire for the things in the present are always stronger. So they overrule the other. So pity keeps being overruled by stronger effects. That's precisely because you have those trade-offs between the present and the future. Like the one I just mentioned, people have to pay a lot of money to invest in research for that, the benefits of which will only turn up 60 years from now. That's a trade-off. And when people want to use that money to satisfy a desire which they have now, pity will be overruled, right? So within Spinoza's philosophy. So the problem here is that it's not so much whether you can generate pity to sustain the creation of a political institution aimed at the long term. It's not that. It's how you can preserve it within the interplay of effects when the effects that are aimed and based on images of the present are always stronger than the ones that relate to the future, even when they are based on the knowledge of good and evil. That's what the expression he uses in Proposition 14. Right? So that's the challenge that we find in Spinoza. That's why we have to take that challenge seriously and then see how in his political philosophy we can find a way to find the solution to this problem. And I think I found that solution in this idea that the Imperium reinstates the conditions of fear and hope and timidity that give rise to the multitude in the first place. Still, it's always a reinstantiation. It's always presentist. It's like keeping a fire ongoing in the fireplace, right? You have to keep throwing firewood at it in order to not let it go out. That's the reinstating. But whenever you throw a piece of wood into the fire, in order for the fire to keep burning, you have to do it now. Right? Burns, and then now, and then now, and then now. And it's always a reinstantiation in the present. But if you do that all the time, the fire can burn indefinitely, right? Like, I don't know, like the fire at Mount Olympus. And that, in that particular sense, you generate stability, but you do it by using a mechanism that is based on instability, right? That's the only way I can see in Spinoza's philosophy to overcome this. Otherwise, any institution just based on pity will disappear after 3 or 4 years when other stronger effects will just push it in another.
Sauf si elles sont capables de créer quelque chose comme une institution. Et c'est ce qu'on voit dans les traités politiques, dans le moment où l'administration est capable de fonctionner comme un moteur de changement.
Yeah.
Je pense que là, c'est le moment où on peut peut-être penser ces changements.
But what do you mean moteur de changement? What do you mean by moteur?
C'est-à-dire, je pense que dans ces cas-là, l'indignation pourrait cristalliser dans quelque chose de plus durable. Ne pas rester uniquement comme un mouvement instable, mais donner lieu à quelque chose qui peut tenir dans le temps. Et qui a une certaine prescription. C'est pour ça que je me posais la question aussi sur la pitié, parce que dans l'émulation, exactement, il y a quelque chose de prescriptif, mais dans l'animation, d'une manière négative aussi. On ne sait pas exactement c'est quoi, mais on ne sait pas vraiment ce qu'on ne veut pas. Et c'est déjà pas mal pour pouvoir construire quelque chose. C'est pour ça que je pose cette question.
Il est presque 8 heures, c'est effrayant parce qu'il y a certainement d'autres questions. Une dernière question peut-être Non, mais là vous direz rien dire, non, monsieur au fond. Quelqu'un veut s'exprimer? Oui, Jean-Charles Roche.
Oui. Je voudrais simplement laisser le côté politique pour revenir à ce que vous disiez sur le mimétisme en lui-même. Dans quelle mesure le mécanisme mimétique ne met pas en danger, ou met-il en danger le conatus? Est-ce que le conatus est suspendu à ce mécanisme mimétique, ou bien est-il en lutte avec lui?
Magnifique question, je trouve.
Oui, but how? I mean, well, that which prompts you to imitate someone is precisely because your conatus pushes you to mirror that thing which it finds similar. And that similarity is a sort of strategy to becoming stronger. It's as if you added to yourself another image of yourself. You would not become two people, you would become a bigger you. So in that sense, the imitation follows from the conatus, right? So how can it be suspended? Everything that allows for understanding the process of imitation is a follow-up of the conatus. You need the conatus in order to understand imitation, not the other way around. That's why the conatus appears in the beginning of Ethics 3 and the imitation only appears afterwards, right? You disagree?
Non, c'est pas ça. C'est que je trouve que la question est magnifique parce que, puisque vous avez évoqué René Girard, l'imitation, c'est quelque chose qui peut vous renforcer, en effet, vous tirez vers le haut d'une certaine façon, parce que vous imitez un maître, vous imitez un musicien, mais ça peut aussi vous déposséder de vous-même. Donc ça peut avoir, comment dire ça peut vous affaiblir, ça peut vous aliéner. Vous voyez. Donc l'imitation a bien ces deux faces.
Ah, oui.
La face qui vous renforce, la face qui vous aliène. C'est pour ça que je trouvais que la question se pose vraiment. Et à force d'imiter, on reste un disciple, on ne devient jamais un maître.
No, but that's a consequence of the conatus, not necessarily a suspension of the conatus, right? So it's like you can never really. You always have that being in a state of nature is always bad, and being in a state of society, even in Hobbesian terms, is also bad. But it's just that it's less bad than being in the state of nature in Hobbesian terms. So that means that everything is bad in the sense that your conatus is never actually free from not being in conflict. So it's a natural consequence of the conatus that it encounters other conatus, and much like what happens in physics, bodies when they collide, they go this way and they go that way, and some of them go faster, others go slower. Those that go faster tend to change the movement more, and those that go slower, and so on and so forth. It's just a consequence of that persistence of movement in that in which one is. And in Spinoza is exactly that in which one is, because the conatus, the striving, has an ontological dimension. So it's a very bad consequence, but I wouldn't call it a suspension, right? So.
Il y a encore des milliers de choses à dire, mais bon, il faudrait parler du Christ. Le chrétien vit à l'imitation du Christ, qui lui-même n'imite personne, parce qu'il s'est délivré de l'imitation, puisqu'il s'est délivré justement du rapport au serpent qui était fait comme moi. Et donc le Christ, c'est celui qui, enfin dans la théologie, et puis alors Spinoza était extrêmement christophile, il faisait du Christ le modèle de la connaissance du troisième genre, et Deleuze a lui-même comparé Spinoza au Christ des philosophes. Donc il y a un rapport très intense entre Spinoza et le Christ, Matron l'a aussi beaucoup souligné, et donc qu'est-ce que c'est que le Christ? C'est celui qui justement n'imite plus, est sorti du cycle de l'imitation, enfin traditionnellement, enfin c'est la thèse de Girard, qui peut être très intéressante. Alors, c'est peut-être impossible, comme vous dites, d'échapper à ce mouvement général d'attraction et de répulsion, mais la figure du Christ représente une espèce d'idéal pour l'homme normal ou pour le chrétien, c'est-à-dire se délivrer de la jalousie, se délivrer de l'envie, se délivrer de la rancœur, de l'amour-haine qu'on porte aux gens qu'on imite, c'est-à-dire qu'on admire et qu'on déteste en même temps. Et le Christ essaye de sortir de ça, quoi. Oui.
Mais à ce sujet, le livre que vous m'avez conseillé de Matron,
le Christ et le salut des ignorants.
J'ai l'impression que Matron ne dit pas que le Christ s'en délivre.
Non.
Matron dit qu'il est né, il est disposé, délivré.
Oui. Oui.
Sans même avoir eu... Enfin, il a reçu d'esprit à esprit.
Oui, ils ne s'en délivrent pas, vous avez tout à fait raison. Mais disons qu'ils représentent quand même un modèle pour Spinoza.
Ah oui.
C'est-à-dire c'est l'ingénieur suprême. Il guérit les malades, et il marche sur l'eau, parce qu'il a la connaissance du troisième genre de la matière. Donc voilà, il domine la matière. C'est comme le capitaine Nemo dans 20 000 lieues sous les mers. C'est la puissance absolue sur la matière, parce qu'il la connaît entièrement. Et alors, bon, ça c'est une vision un peu nietzschéenne, si on veut, ou de Spinoza, mais je pense pas qu'elle soit fausse. Mais le Christ est clairement... Spinoza se voyait dans la succession du Christ, c'est clair. Hein. Quelqu'un qui a renoncé à imiter, qui a renoncé à l'imitation. Parce qu'il n'a pas besoin d'une certaine façon. Alors, bien sûr, c'est impossible à strictement parler, mais il y a quand même cette espèce de vision.
Oui. But in that particular sense, maybe what I call reproduction as a third kind of mimesis, perhaps I would say that it could function as a sort of suspension, or ideally of the first kind of mimesis, even though it never really occurs because you're always trapped in all kinds of mimesis, even for the wise man. And the Christ would be an example of that kind of reproduction, that is the scientia intuitiva that functions in all realms. Not entirely sure about the Captain Nemo reference as the Christ, but that's very interesting.
Il marche sous l'eau, mais...
Oui. Exactement.
Oui, mais c'est un peu ça quand même, hein. C'est un peu ça. On ne peut pas être trompé quand on lit les 20 000 lieues sous les mers. C'est ça, quoi. C'est l'ingénieur divin, quoi. Celui qui domine la matière. Bon. Est-ce qu'il y a encore une ultime question? Non? Eh bien,
I do have
oui.
a question.
Ah.
Yeah, I do have a question based on the last section and your answer to Monsieur Ramon's question. That is, I wonder when the theory of conatus is applied from an individual to the political instruction. I wonder how the transition, not only the transition is made, but also, most importantly, the transition itself is that how we differ the conatus of the political instruction itself and the individuals that it included by the political instruction.
Okay.
Short answer.
Short answer.
If possible.
I have an entire chapter in that book, Spinoza's Revolutions in Natural Law, saying that I don't think that the state is an individual. It doesn't fit the category of being an individual. And if that's the case, you can't really say that it has a conatus. So that's my easy way out. There's no conatus.
So how do we explain
You can say that it acts as if it had a conatus, but that doesn't mean it has an ontological density the way individuals have it. But it acts in precisely that way that I was saying, that strategy of building an imperium that reproduces an instance of stability. That's the closest you have to a conatus. So if you have that stability, that can only be provided by a political structure that reinstantiates the moments.
So
and so on.
you
You see something that is similar to a conatus at work, right? Because it keeps persevering in that political structure. Although I don't think it's a conatus per se. Right? But there are lots of good Spinoza scholars that do think it is.
Yeah. So when we seek of stability in certain political measurements, we seek for stabilities for the political itself or for the people that be included by the state, or
we look for stability in the sense that we seek to somehow order the realm of conflict that the effects generate that keep the body politic united. So that constant threat that it can be dissolved at any moment is controlled, so to speak. And that means that you have what Spinoza calls security. And security, he says, is the lack of doubt concerning what it is that's going to happen next. right? When you have security in the sense that you know that what will happen in the future, you know what that will be. You're not uncertain about that, what will be. You have the expectation that it will occur in a certain sense, and that is what's going to happen. That's security. But security is an effect that depends on the category of duration. It depends on how you relate to time. And you can only have security when you have a political structure that generates effects that somehow allow you to feel safe. Right?
Thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, André. It was wonderful. Merci beaucoup à tous. Nous nous retrouverons le 20 février avec un exposé de Andrea Sangiacomo sur la kinesthésique spinoziste et les genres de connaissances en mouvement. Donc on rejoint un peu le thème de la vitesse que vous avez évoqué tout à l'heure. Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine fois.
Au revoir. Merci.